Well, good morning again. Let's go ahead and get started. Just a couple quick housekeeping items before we get going here. We have everybody muted, and the reason we do this, it just cuts down on a lot of the background noise. So if you have questions as we go through the presentation, just use that chat or dialogue box where you logged in. And you can post questions, and then at the end of the presentation here in 20 or 25 minutes, I'll go through those questions and answer any questions you have. I'll also place my contact information up here on the screen as well. Taking a quick divergence here, I wanted to start off really with a very timely article. And again, I'm Mike McCarty. I'm the CEO of Safe Hiring Solutions. And I wanted to mention this incident that was reported last night in the local news here in Indianapolis, just to show you really what you're up against as organizations that work with children. This is a convicted sex offender. And so what had happened is an athletic team at Mooresville Community Schools come back, I guess, from an athletic event, and this particular sex offender, along with another person, tried to blend in and get into the school. And so I think it was the athletic director or somebody noticed them, called them out on it. And so this is a registered sex offender from Indianapolis, had been convicted in Morgan County of child molesting. But just looking at how bold and brazen this person is trying to gain access to our children, I can tell you here at Safe Hiring, we probably see incidents like this on a monthly basis that aren't necessarily always making it into the news media, but that we see sex offenders month after month trying to gain access to organizations that work with children. So if you haven't seen this, it's actually WTHR reported this in Indianapolis, so you can look it up and see what they reported last night. But just really, just illustrates what we were wanting to talk about today, which is really, protecting our kids and background screening. And so, again, like I said, I'm Mike McCarty. I founded Safe Hiring a little over 11 years ago. I'm also the CEO of RefLink, which is a totally automated reference checking software. And so, as groups are working with volunteers, we created RefLink to do two things. One, we had a lot of employers that use RefLink. It automates the reference checking instead of phone calls. It's all done through the software system, very inexpensive. But especially for volunteer organizations, we've had groups like Kiwanis International, really large volunteer organizations. Recently, one came on board with about 10,000 volunteers that are adopting RefLink. And one of the reasons they're adopting RefLink is it allows them to dig deeper and wider on a potential volunteer utilizing reference checks that they wouldn't be able to do otherwise because they didn't have the staffing to be able to make, 3 or 4 phone calls per volunteer. And so the system does all the work for you. It's very critical, as we mentioned, a sex offender right out of the gate, because about 80% of sex offenders in the United States do not have a criminal record. And so we could spend the rest of this 30-minute session talking about why that is, but it's just a lot of systemic system failure with how we address sexual violence in the United States. And so at the end of the day, the vast majority of sex offenders you're trying to keep out of your organization, you're not going to be able to successfully do that 100% with a criminal background check alone. There's got to be other tools that are utilized to keep sex offenders out, and part of that would be deep, wide reference checks. So if you want any more information on RefLink, you can send me a message offline. We can set up a demo to show you how that works, and then we'll talk more about SafeVisitor here in a minute, just managing the background screening volunteer process and letting it manage all of that process for you. My background was a violent crime detective, Metro Nashville PD in Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm from Indiana, grew up here, father, Indiana State Police, family all in law enforcement. I'm a Wabash College grad, so I'd only left for a few years as a detective in Nashville before I came back and started Safe Hiring. So why are we here? Safety of our children. We're wanting to understand some of the limitations of the volunteer screening programs and kind of look at best practices. Also, if we are using like the limited criminal history, because quite honestly, that's one of the focus areas we're going to talk about here in just a second, is what are the real limitations with the limited criminal history. We'll look at both the data limitations, but now we've seen some kind of paradigm shifts in how the information is coming back, which is really turning into a more costly solution than it used to be for volunteer organizations. A lot of times we hear about this, something is better than nothing. So we talk about, okay, there's limitations with the limited criminal history or whatever system that we're using. But that attorneys sometimes said, well, as long as you're doing something that's better than nothing, well, somewhat true. Maybe that's a legal perspective, but it's not a moral perspective. So if we're in the business of taking care of children, we shouldn't be looking for these lowest level thresholds. We should be looking at, okay, what's the best practice? How do we keep our children and our staff and employees safe? And we're in a crazy world. I mean, what happened in San Bernardino last week? These are the kind of incidents that unfortunately is the world we live in, and I'm afraid to say that it may become more normalized than we've ever been accustomed to in this country. And so the tool sets that we're going to use to protect our organizations are going to have to adapt with kind of the world that we're encountering today. And so the cheap background checks, not going to work. They're not going to protect your organization. And so what we really want to do is look at, okay, what's the best practice? How can we not only, manage, a quality background screening program, but how do we, keep our organizations and those we serve safe? So just a little bit of history on the limited criminal history. Up until 2009, this was the tool that for Indiana school districts, this was what they used for all their background screening. Now, we've worked with schools for 11 years, so some of the schools would do this and then also run our national background check. But up until 2009, this was kind of the only requirement for Indiana schools. And the reason I mention schools is because when you look at a community, typically you'll look at, okay, the school district is a pretty good model of, best policies or practices. And so what happened in 2009 is the Indiana legislature removed this as an option for employment screening and or screening of contractors or vendors that have any contact with a student, and removed it because it's not sufficient. Not only is it not sufficient, then there was inherent problems within that limited criminal history that was exposing schools to a lot of risk. I would argue that really should have gone one step further and said really not just employees and or contractors, but anybody coming into that school should have to have a higher level background check. Because quite honestly, you get a school district that maybe hires 100 employees a year, but they might have 1,500 or 3,000 volunteers. It's an enormous amount of risk. And so just like the sex offender right out of the gate, if we're not, running a tool that has checks and balances that's going to ensure that everybody walking in, parent, volunteer, anybody that's coming into that school has had an adequate background check, how do we know we're going to flag them? Because quite honestly, one of the things that exposed some of the issues with the limited criminal history was back in 2004, and really was the kind of what precipitated me starting Safe Hiring was a large local school district had hired 2 sex offenders, and they had run the limited criminal history, which had come back clear. And so they were perplexed. They were in the evening news, in the Indianapolis Star and WTHR again, had run an expose, a 2-day expose. And so the school was saying, hey, look, we did what the state required. And how did it not show up? Not just once, but twice in this short period of time, they hired sex offenders. And so I know if you're on this call today or the webinar, the one thing you are concerned with if you're working with children is, keeping violent predators and violent offenders away from your children. And one of the things in 2004 that happened was the Indianapolis Star in Channel 13 here in Indianapolis pulled 10 names off the Indiana Sex Offender Registry, and they ran them through the limited criminal history, and only 2 out of the 10 sex offenders showed up. I mean, granted, that's a very low sample for a study, but even in a low sample study of 10 sex offenders, to have an 80% failure rate is absolutely alarming. I would think if you ran 100 sex offenders and had a single one didn't show up in the database would be terribly alarming. And so it opened up the window to look at, okay, what are the problems? Well, the problems are many communities in Indiana were not sending their criminal data to the state. And Marion County here in Indianapolis is an example. The clerk didn't realize that they were required to do this by law. They went to Allen County, they went to Vanderburgh, they went to a lot of counties in Indiana, particularly larger counties, and a lot of that data was not being sent to the state. So if you're using the limited criminal history, there's a very good likelihood that there's huge gaps of data because many communities were not even sending that data to the state prior to 2004 in this expose, and how long after that before the data started rolling in on a consistent basis. So you got large gaps in data. The other issues you deal with the limited criminal history is it only includes Class A misdemeanors and above. So for an example, if a person assaults their wife, so you have domestic battery, and this is part of a plea agreement that gets reduced to a Class B misdemeanor, it's not going to show up in the limited criminal history. It's only Class A misdemeanors and above. And I will tell you, as a former detective, our whole criminal justice system revolves around plea bargaining. I mean, there's no way our criminal justice system can handle jury trials or judge or bench trials on every case that's generated. There's no way. It would totally flood and stall the whole system. So the whole system works on negotiation, defense and prosecutor negotiating a settlement just like you would in a civil trial, but this is criminal, and whatever they negotiate, a lot of times it gets reduced, and that's where they plea bargain these things out. It also does not include cases of arrest that are not adjudicated as conviction. And so we can show you on our national background checks arrest data. There's no restrictions on volunteers, and there shouldn't be. We should be able to show you that information because with cases like domestic violence, stalking, a lot of cases involving children, you will have non-convictions because oftentimes you're relying on a child witness, a family witness, somebody that's terrified of the offender. And so a lot of times you may see history here where you've got 3 and 4 different cases over a period of time related to child abuse or domestic violence that are getting dismissed, and oftentimes they're getting dismissed because you have reluctant witnesses because they're scared. And so we think you need to be able to see that information. The law says you need to be able to see that information or have the ability to see that information. It's not restricted, but the limited criminal history is not going to show you that if it gets adjudicated as a non-conviction. The database could also contain expunged information. So this is the other side. Indiana passed an expungement law, I think it's 3 or 4 years ago now. So it makes expunging misdemeanor and Class D felonies that are non-violent, it makes that process a lot easier. And so you cannot use expunged cases against a person. It can't be shown. And so a lot of times these databases have expunged information in them, and if it's not removed, it could put you on the hook legally for using information that's not reportable. And so that's one of the reasons. There's really probably 2 reasons why, if you're running volunteers through the limited criminal history, you're starting to get letters back from the state recommending they submit to fingerprints. And that could be twofold. It could be they see something in the database, but they're unsure whether or not it's your candidate or not. And the only way to resolve that would be to go to the clerk of the county court, which is what we do on every single case that we get at no extra fee. And then the other reason they may return that is because they don't want to take the responsibility to determine whether or not it's your candidate. And so they want you to submit to the fingerprints, which is now increasing the cost of your volunteer background check significantly. And I know we have, one of the largest school districts in the state recently told me that they're seeing as many as 30 or 40% of their volunteer checks are now coming back with recommendations for fingerprints. So it's become a very costly process for them. The other issue from the screening side with the limited criminal history is really how do you verify the identity of your candidates? And so if I'm coming in on a back to school night and I'm filling out a form for a background check that you can run a limited criminal history, you're relying on the information I put on that form. I could lie to you about my name. I could leave off other names I've been known by. I could change the spelling of my name, and you may or may not pick up on that. And so it needs to have a tool built into it so that that tool can identify not only the person but any other names they've been known by. And so that's some of the issues related to the limited criminal history. Some of the other potential legal problems, there's a huge movement afoot in the United States, a kind of a legal movement that's now starting to say and gaining some legal consensus that volunteers are bound by the Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act. And so all of your employment hiring, if you're using a third party like us, are bound by the FCRA. But there is a movement afoot that says volunteers also fall under this guidelines of the FCRA. Well, if that is true, and it's a bit gray at this time, but I can tell you we've made changes internally to our system on the front end on disclosure statements and authorizations to mirror what's required under the federal law. But on the back end, if it's found and more case law develops, which there is some case law out there, but if more case law develops and it becomes apparent that yes, volunteers do fall under the FCRA, then there's going to be real problems when you're using the limited criminal history, because the federal law would say any database is out-of-date information, and there's a requirement under the FCRA that the data have a maximum possible accuracy, and the FCRA would say no database unless it is updated every day immediately with dispositional updates from the court systems would not have maximum possible accuracy. So you could be exposing yourself to potential risk. And so I only mention this here today because it's a growing consensus and it's an area that you probably want to keep a close eye on. We're really, moving all of our organizations that do volunteer background checks into a safer mode where we're handling the information as it comes in, FCRA compliant, and we would handle any negative information so that our clients are protected if in fact it is deemed that volunteers fall under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. We've mentioned this already. Some of what I would say is a best practice for a volunteer at a minimum should include a Social Security verification, national criminal database, and a county criminal search at a minimum. And so, with the limited criminal history, one other problem you're dealing with is it's only Indiana data. So even if it was really accurate data, you're still only getting information just from Indiana. And what's the likelihood that your volunteers have never traveled outside the state of Indiana? Some of you are from Northwest Indiana or different pockets of the state where you're close to the state lines, where they're probably frequently traveling across state lines, maybe each day to work or to shop. But most people have been outside the state on business or on travel. So we moved that to a national background check. And we just rolled out last week some special pricing on volunteers here in Indiana. We've got a $12.95 national background check. And we can do this a couple different ways. There's a lot of organizations that are now asking the volunteer to pay for this background check. Very common standard these days. They can pay for part or some of the background check, and so we've got a couple different ways that we can make this work for you as an organization. One of the other issues that I wanted to mention is really then how do I manage all of this process? And so I wanted to quickly show you and discuss a new system that we also had launched about a year and a half ago. We work real closely with Fort Wayne Community Schools. We built a system called SafeVisitor. And what SafeVisitor is, it's a visitor management system. And so just like the sex offender was trying to get into the school there at Mooresville, this system flags people at the door, and so they have to qualify to be able to enter an organization. So it handles all your temporary visitors to an organization. It manages all of your volunteers, and what that means is your volunteers would click on a link. They would, e-sign for your visitor policy. They would electronically sign for a background check. They would enter their data. They could even pay for the background check. It pushes it over to Safe Hiring. We run the background check on the Safe Hiring side, and then it pushes the information back into SafeVisitor, and it would approve your volunteers if they have no criminal history. It would flag them if they have a criminal record, and you would review that in SafeVisitor and approve or deny them. Once they're approved, you've set a standard for, okay, their approval's good for 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, whatever you set that at. And so they get an electronic ID card, and then they scan each time they enter and exit your facility so that you know who's entering, who's in the building at any given time, and you have historic data. Same thing with vendors. It's handled the same way. And so I'll give you just a really quick kind of overview of how this process works. So if I'm a volunteer, this is kind of a link you would have, just like this link is set up right here. They select, I'm a volunteer, I'm a vendor. Actually, we just changed this to a drop-down menu to make it more clear. They start the process. You'll see there's some changes coming because now the first thing they're going to do is they're going to e-sign for your visitor policy. Then they're going to, enter the data fields that are required. Let me do this so we can move to the next screen. Put their address in. Whoops. And then they select building or building. So if you have a single building, it will be preset. If you have multiple buildings, like Fort Wayne as an example here has 50 buildings, they would select the buildings that they want access to. And so if they have children in multiple buildings, they can select multiple buildings. They go to the next step, which this step would be the first step now, where they e-sign for your visitor policy. You can add your language. So if you have like state requirements as a school that they complete a bullying training, you could actually put that in here where they e-sign that they've completed that. And then it's going to push it over for the background check. And then how this works is your, let me impersonate my demo company here. And so how this would work is they would internally, you're going to be setting on a dashboard. You'll have this dashboard, and actually we're working on a kiosk right now. We were doing a little bit of work on this right before we started. And so with the kiosk, what's going to happen is we're creating this kiosk that could actually be used, or it could set in between secured doors. And so we have some school districts here that, and actually I'm going to log out and log directly into our demo site. The kiosk would actually allow you to place this kiosk in between secured doors, and so as people enter and exit your facility, they would actually interact with the dashboard as they enter and exit the facility. And so they would come in, instead of just hitting a buzzer to buzz into your school, they would actually enter, and as they enter, they would come to the kiosk. They could select, I'm a volunteer, I'm a visitor, I'm a vendor, and so those type of visitors would have an ID card. There's a scanner, they scan it, it's going to push the information across the server, and it's actually going to have that information come up on a dashboard like you're seeing right here, where the security or the secretary would see that information, verify the information before you even hit the buzzer and allow them to enter the facility. So you'll have a couple different options in how you want to do this or how you want to set it up. And so if we're running it manually, it would look like this. I come in, I click on temporary visitor. It's going to pop up. You'll have a scanner, and it'll scan the 2D barcode on the back of their driver's license. I'm just going to type my name in here because I don't have my scanner set up. And so assuming I just scanned in, it pulls all the information off of the back of your driver's license. And so if you look at the back of your government issued driver's license, you'll see there's a barcode. And so part of the reason we use that technology is because it makes it more difficult for people to create false identification and be able to enter your facility. It pulls the encoded data off that government issued ID. So as we go to the next step, I want to show you something before we do, because I won't be back to the webcam, is on a temporary visitor. So this is somebody coming in for a meeting, somebody that's a low volume visitor we're processing right now. It's actually going to print this temporary visitor tag as they enter. And you'll see this stop sign down in the corner. Just place this white sticker, looking at it backwards, place this sticker over the stop sign, and what happens is in about 6 hours the stop sign bleeds back through, peels off on their clothing. But if they try to re-enter the building the next day, it'll be immediately obvious this ID tag has expired. And so kind of going through this slowly, Fort Wayne Community School has been running this program now for about a year and a half. Their front office staff at their administration building could tell you they'll process a visitor in 30 to 45 seconds. So it actually speeds the process, gets rid of the book that you may have sitting on the secretary's desk where people sign in. They sign in, you don't really know who they are, so it just makes the process more secure in the entering. What it just did right there is it ran a background check. It ran 2 types of background checks. First thing it did is it ran a National Sex Offender Registry check. So it checks against the National Sex Offender Registry, and if it would have found any data, it would have put it right here and would have linked you to the National Sex Offender data so you could review it in more detail. It also ran what we call an exclusion list. So on a client-by-client basis, you can actually create exclusion lists. These could be problematic ex-employees, problematic volunteers. It could be an employee that works for you that's going through a divorce and they've had a history of being harmed in a relationship, so they obtain a protective order. You could enter the other person that they are going through the divorce with into the exclusion list as another layer of protection, so that if that other party tried to show up at your organization, it would flag them as they enter. And so if somebody hits on an exclusion list, 2 things happen. One, you hit a deny button. And when you deny them, the first thing it's going to do is automate a text message to your preset group of contacts. So if you've got a security team, security officers, administrators that are deemed responsible for security for your building, they get a text message that tells them somebody in the excluded list trying to enter the building, and it tells them exactly which building and which door, and so that they can move toward the front desk to assist with this. The other way that notification system works is you have this emergency button up here, you'll notice in the top left. Let's say somebody comes into the organization and maybe they're not even there to visit, but they come in and they become problematic. The worst thing to happen is escalate the situation by having to pick up a phone, verbalize, hey, I've got a crazy person standing here in front of me, I need assistance at the front desk. What the system allows you to do is to come up here, click this button, and it sends that emergency notification to that preset team again. This time it tells them, hey, I got an emergency, exactly where it's at, what building, and what door, so that they can work to that front desk and provide assistance. So you've always got the capability on every screen to send an emergency help for needing some assistance. So it allows you to do this where it's not going to escalate the situation by having to verbally say anything. If it comes back like this, everything comes back clear. They just simply, and the kiosk will allow them to do this work. They type in who they're visiting and the reason for the visit, and then you allow and print that temporary badge that I just showed you. And then once you do that, they've been logged into your organization, and your organization will have a running log down here of anybody that's currently in your building. But if you're an organization kind of like that has multiple buildings, if you're an administrator, you can see everybody that's in a building at any given time. Or if I'm actually an attendant in building A, I'm only going to see who's in my building. The other thing is we create this button so when people exit, they can scan out, or they can simply, interact with the kiosk to remove themselves, or you can actually just click this button and it would show that they have exited the building. And the reason for that is we want really accurate visit logs. I know one of our large school districts recently had a complaint, and one of the complaints, I don't know what the complaint itself was, but basically a person said, I've never been in your school before. They went in here, ran a visitor log, and they said, actually, you were in our school on this date from this time to this time. And it ended whatever complaint was being made. And so you have access to that historic data. If you're dealing with a volunteer or a vendor that's already been pre-screened and issued an ID, when they enter and exit, then you're just going to click on this button and they just scan in with their ID card, enter the building, scan when they leave, exit. So you always know who's entering and exiting your facility. The other thing that you have access to is you can set up that exclusion list like I mentioned. And so you can create these exclusion lists based on your internal policies. You have to have a minimum of a first and last name. If you have multiple buildings, you could set somebody up as excluded from a single building, or you set them up globally, means they can't come on any of your property. You can move people on and off the exclusion list. You have reasons, and you can add information here. And then you can handle, adding people to your account, administrators, attendants, buildings. So that's kind of a really, really fast, quick overview of SafeVisitor. It is the only visitor management system in the United States that is also integrated with a high-level, comprehensive, national, multi-layered criminal background check for like volunteers and vendors. And so this system will manage all of that for you. If you say your volunteer background checks are good for 2 years, then 30 days before the background check expires, the system can automate an email to your volunteer letting them know it's going to expire. Click on the link if you need to reinitiate. If you're no longer going to volunteer, then they'll fall off. The minute that they pass the 2-year mark, they move into an expired, so they cannot scan in and out of your organization any longer. I know we ran over just a couple minutes. I apologize for that. I was talking as fast as I could. I'm going to put my information back up here, and I'm going to pause for a second to see if we have any questions. If you do have, or want more information on SafeVisitor, RefLink, the volunteer pricing, give me a call, shoot me an email. We'll be happy to get that information. So I'm looking through here. I don't see any questions. Hopefully that doesn't mean I put everybody to sleep. And so feel free to reach out to me if you do have questions, and we will be able to provide you any information you have. Hope you have a great day. Enjoy the holidays, and we appreciate working with you. Thanks.